Hello, everyone. This is Vikram Prakash, and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode, we try and have a conversation with a contemporary commentator to advance the frontier of architectural thinking. Today, I am bringing to you the next of my conversations with the Niger-based, New York operating, and also Switzerland-based amazing architect Mariam Kamara. And we are continuing our conversation trying to get into the complexities and difficulties of building a practice that identifies itself as moored within the Nigerian, West African historical, cultural, and intellectual ethos, but at the same time is not limited by it and does not contests the Eurocentric legacies, but at the same time does not consider itself as having to absolve itself of its affiliations with the West. Overall, the direction is to find a way to break free of the binaries of East and West, North, South, and so on, and to get to another way of being and acting and designing and being an architect in the world without losing the specificities of locality or without ignoring the asymmetries of colonial, post-colonial, and contemporary global power. A fantastic conversation, goes in many different directions, no great grand solution, but it lays out a problematic which I think many of you listening to me would be already familiar with. I hope you enjoy the conversation. As always, if you have suggestions about whom I might converse with, or if you just have comments for me, please reach out and send me an email at vikram.prakash@gmail.com. Here we go.
Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
I did listen to it.
I
listened to it
prohibit you
today,
from doing that.
and I was like, oh my God. Like, I'm saying the same thing over and over
I've
again.
already got like 3 or 4 wonderful comments on our first episode.
Really? I'm
Yeah.
surprised because I was just kind of like, what's wrong with me? Like, why am I complaining so much?
You know, about 80% of the people I interview, they never want to hear themselves. They never like, I don't want to hear myself.
Like, I don't want to
I
hear
want
it.
to know
Just
what
put it
you
out
said.
there.
I don't want to have nothing to do with it.
It's like, I said what I had to say. Goodbye.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. And everybody's
I know.
convinced that they sounded like an idiot in the
That's
recording, but
definitely
it's
how I
not true. But it's not true.
It's completely how I feel. It was like the most basic, like non-profound stuff ever.
It's just not
But
true.
no, but going back to what you were saying, I think, honestly, I think that is the most important conversation of the 21st century when it comes to architecture. And it's not, like, this is the most critical thing we can do and that we should do, I believe.
It's critical and it's urgent, right? It's urgent.
Very.
I mean, we need new imaginaries for architecture.
Yeah.
And my thinking is the reason why these imaginaries are possibly found in non-Euro-modernist epistemologies is because these imaginaries are places where the long history of humanity imbricated in them, right?
Yes.
Which is to say, we have been living with the earth for a very, very long time.
Exactly.
And we have learned that basically we have to learn to share the planet, right? We have to learn to share the planet with animals, beautiful animals behind you. I can see in this wonderful, wonderful painting.
This is a painting made out of sand, by the way.
There you go. Paintings made out of sand,
Exactly.
architecture made out of sand.
Exactly.
And so when we see paintings like this of people walking with animals, we think of these as amazing exotics or primitivists, which is pointless, which is of no interest other than sort of for exotic purposes. What we need to do is to learn how to relive in a symbiotic manner with animals, with trees, with the planet, with the air, with the other, not only animals, but with other intelligences and consciousnesses.
Yes. Yes.
And these knowledges are present, So I think certainly Native American knowledges have a lot of understanding of, for instance, fungus.
Exactly. A lot of wisdom.
Wisdom. Thank you.
It's the wisdom of the people, like you said, for millennia.
Yeah.
So you're not going to tell me that whatever wisdom you evolved over a century and a half trumps wisdoms that have been, kind of arrived to after 5,000 years. Like, what are we saying?
Yeah. Like, modern knowledges are also very important. No question about it, right? Science and
they have to come together.
And just because a thing is 5,000 years old doesn't mean it's good.
Absolutely.
But in both cases, there are values to be found. And the hard work we have to do is to sift through, learn to listen, organize, collect, synthesize, propose, and imagine these things now.
Yeah. I could not agree more, because that's literally actually the title of my chair. Like,
what is the title of your chair?
So it's the chair of Architecture, Heritage, and Sustainability.
Okay. I'm suspicious of heritage as a word, but anyway, go on.
But that's the thing, because my whole point is to actually also reframe heritage.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean old building over there. It doesn't
There you go. Yeah.
In the same way that also sustainability doesn't only mean environmental sustainability.
Yeah.
Ecologies are both of nature, of communities, of economies, of, those are all ecological systems, because it's just kind of like these things that we need in order to survive. I prefer now talking about sustainabilities rather than sustainability, because all of that, we cannot isolate, we have to save the planet, but okay, so part of the reason why also we're destroying the planet is because there's this other economic imperatives that are making pressure into this other thing, but then also what we're doing from an economic point of view, it's destroying cultural, kind of sustainabilities and communities, and the whole thing is all intertwined.
Right.
And so it's actually a title that that sounds narrow, but it's like incredibly wide in terms of the things that we would be tackling, both from a sustainability point of view and from heritage, meaning wisdoms in general of various aspects. Right. Even cultural wisdoms, not just architectural wisdoms, or wisdoms related to other systems. Right. That we can, as we say, sift and try to figure out what is it that could be useful and that could help create. And we were talking about that, I think, on the podcast, about how to create these new hybrid models that are not an either or. It's not about, I'm resolutely only technology based and that's the only thing, or I'm saying that I'm a traditionalist. All of it is. Yeah, we got to get away from this whole traditionalist. First of all, we got to get away from tradition and modernity. I mean, these are sort of like. Yeah, we need to use different words. Yes, words. Right. Yeah. So one is to sort of also, what would be, I think both words we should sit down, just not discuss this. Okay. What would be another word for heritage as you're describing? Because heritage, let us say, is too heavily saturated with this whole idea of, old cultural identities and that kind of stuff. Right. Yeah. Because it's not the past. It's not. It's the presentness of the past, and indeed the futurity of this past, which is the key thing. Right. So I guess for me, it's about the relevance of things that have already been figured out. Continued relevance. It's about creating a continuity rather than saying that progress is just about only new things. Yeah. But what's wrong with a couple of the older things? And the older things can be evolved, because again, it's not about also reconsuming or remaking old things. It's about learning from old ways that have some wisdom into today and some relevance into today and could help for tomorrow, and see how to make them evolve into tomorrow.
Well, this indigenous scholar, Grace Dillon, talks about this concept of indigenous futurism, which is, connected to this whole world of Afrofuturism.
Yes, exactly.
The whole thing going. Because futurism has this connotation, right? That we are going to invent the future and make the future and do it. And what we are talking about is undoing the idea of designing and imagining futures from the idea of linear progress, which is that only the latest, newest, and betterest is better.
And that everything else should be discarded every time we find something new.
Yeah. Every time it's sort of a reinvention, constant innovation, and innovation. But that holds all those cycles of constant new innovation and technology need to be supplemented with a recovery of other types of knowledges. Haraway talks, for instance, about fungal knowledges, octopus knowledges, tentacular knowledges, because she's an animal anthropologist, biologist.
Right.
And that's how we took. Have I told you? I told you about my Kishkinda, New York project. Have I? Did we talk about that?
No, I watched it. I watched this whole amazing
You
video.
watched the whole video. You watched the whole video. Yes.
Yeah, it was incredible.
The forest city, right?
Forest city, exactly. We talked about that, and I watched it.
So that story for me, the idea that a forest can be a city, is a radical concept, right? I mean, in the sense that it's both a forest and a city. And that's what we have to imagine. We have to do it. We have to learn to live in a way that we are both living in the forest and the city, and they are not opposed. Right. And clearly, those imaginaries were present in this text, 2,000-year-old.
Yes, and they were practiced. Successfully.
And if we take that idea and then combine it with the beastie we designed, it's just an imaginary. We don't know how to do it.
Look, even when we think about, I'm thinking about it because also yesterday I was listening to, I forgot who you were talking to, but then it just, makes me think about even like cave architecture, for example, or, all kinds of other different ways of approaching the nature that's around us and the material that around us and the things that we have available in order to make architectures that are not necessarily just about putting an object in the world, but that are about weaving yourself into the natural environment that you're in. To me, that's what cave architecture is. It's just kind of like, or it's like Ajanta, or like it's just kind of, it's so amazing because it wasn't about taming nature.
No, it's not about taming nature. Exactly.
Yeah. It was not about taming nature, and we're obsessed with taming nature. It was literally about trying to figure out how to fuse yourself with it.
Or I put it differently. So another bad word is nature. It's like heritage. So when we say nature and we say man-made versus nature or artificial versus nature, we've already separated ourselves out. And
we're also nature.
We are also nature. And inversely, nature is smart like us.
Yes.
Nature is intelligent.
It has
nature
intelligence.
has consciousness. Animals have consciousness. Plants have consciousness. Fungus think, and
because they strategize.
They strategize.
Yes.
Did I share that Karen Barard's article that what is it called? Matter feels, converses, suffers, desires, yearns, and remembers.
It's the most visible thing. Matter remembers. The traces are there. Yeah.
Yes. No, and literally remembers. It will remember. It will, about it.
Yeah. And it makes adjustments. And if it encounters the same thing again, it will react differently because it's not insane like us. We're crazy. We do the same mistakes over and over again because we don't remember.
It remembers better. Because matter has a million-year-old memory. It has a billion-year-old memory.
Exactly. No, it's incredible. I am completely with you because for me, this is actually what I've been focusing on lately in terms of direction, because I think after the first few years of practice, I started realizing that what I was doing was actually not about Niger. And in fact, it was not about Africa. It was about what I was trying to do, something that started with reclaiming the identity of a place and giving voice to a place and doing justice to a place when it comes to architecture, rather than, saying that there is really nothing here and we need to import from somewhere else, which was my starting point. Quite quickly started morphing into, no, actually, I think this is how we should approach everything. This is how we approach architecture everywhere, or we should everywhere. Once I said that to myself, then I started realizing, oh, actually further than that, that's not even what I mean. Really, there are just some kind of fundamental ways of approaching, then going back to what you're saying, your environment, nature, even if we don't want to say nature, the ecologies that inhabit a place and how you compose with that. In architecture. And then I realized that fundamentally, actually, that's what I care about. And what was irking me and made me start with Niger was because that's not what was happening. And it was quite the opposite. And it was violent and it was dehumanizing. And it was, and so then that means that when you don't do that, you're actually being violent and dehumanizing and, like all of those things.
Right.
Then for me, it started becoming like a universal, problematic global problem. And then has tentacles. Then there's like all the ramifications of modernism, as you said, related to sustainability or lack thereof, or the fact that we destroyed the planet in a century and a half, and when we've been living on it for so long. I mean, that should be the most alarming. I don't understand why it's a debate when, again, we've been around for a while. The fact that what we managed to do in a century is incredible in terms of damage.
One of the things that obviously comes out of planetary thinking is, the Earth has been through 5 major extinctions.
Yes.
Which is to say, life on Earth has been through 5 major extinctions. So one thing we have to, of course, remember is another extinction is not going to be much of an event in the Earth's life. It will survive, life will survive, and better things will evolve.
We won't be around. That's all.
We probably won't be around, so no big deal, right? And that also connects me to another South Asian idea, which is the idea of yugs, which is like, these cycles have to happen because this is how life happens. Yes. Life always goes in these circles.
Yes.
And you can't have this idea of a straight line forever going up is extremely myopic.
Well, not only is it myopic, but we're actually we're seeing, the cycle. We're at a bend of a cycle right now, where again, Western civilization and everything that entails, and that's kind of starting to dip, and other civilizations that used to be on top, like in Asia and all that, are like starting to come to the top, and it's like,
that too.
This is inevitable. This is completely inevitable. This is what will happen because it's happened before and it will happen again.
It has happened again. Well, what comes out of that is, learning to live with death, decay, and ruin as an integral part of life. Rather than constant renewal and newness. And that's an idea we don't like in architecture. We hate it.
I love that because one of the things, one of the thoughts I had the other day was, what's one of the biggest crime of the architecture we're making today, the architecture of like steel and glass, and concrete, which ages very ungracefully, is that we have given up making beautiful ruins.
There
are no beautiful ruins possible anymore. What building do you know that's out there that is going to turn into a beautiful ruin like the ones that we excavate now and we're still like, oh my God, this is amazing?
True.
We don't make that kind of architecture anymore.
Yes.
Even if we it's just kind of like the ruins that we're kind of setting ourselves for, because like you said, it will decay, it will, are also like devastatingly.
And the other question that arises with this is, how to live in ruins.
Yes.
Not only to excavate them, but how to live with them.
But we have that. We have that in Niger. We live in ruins.
How?
It happens in cities like Agadez, stuff where kind of some of the knowledge of how the renewal, because also things last forever, not because they don't age, but because we know how to renew them.
Yeah.
And again, like the kinds of materials that we use now are not really good at renewal. But kind of the more noble, quote unquote, materials and the more kind of natural materials are good at allowing us to renew, so that you're not always the same. You're made to continue to perform, but always kind of like nature, like it's like a renewal. You're not maintaining the same identity. It evolves. And so when I go to towns like Agadez that we have, which is like 500, 600 years old, I see that there, because I see people living in homes that that their families have lived in for 300 years.
Yeah.
But it doesn't look the same.
Yeah.
It's the same material. They renew it. Parts of it looks like a complete ruin, and they allow that because they're like, well, I don't need that side of the house anymore. So now the animal lives there. It doesn't have a roof anymore. So it's the animal pen. This other part, we added another level to it. And, we pack the mud a certain way, and it's just kind of like forever, just kind of morphing and transforming, and parts are allowed to become ruins because it's like, no, this doesn't serve our purposes right now. But then 20 years from now, someone else in the family can decide, well, actually, I need this side now. So then the ruin will be kind of regenerated and renewed, and, pack some more new mud on it, or whatever, and turn it into something else. That's how they live.
Beautiful. Reminds me of two things. One is have you heard of the living bridges of Chirapunji?
No, I have not.
There are bridges made out of roots of trees, where there are trees growing, and they slowly weave the roots across the water.
That's amazing.
So they're living trees. So every time you walk across,
so the bridge is alive.
Huh?
The bridge is alive. That's incredible. Anyway.
So there are these living bridges, right? And what that means, the moment you stop using the bridge, either the tree will take over and make the whole thing into, or the bridge will come apart.
Yes, exactly.
So that's the one thing I thought about.
Yeah.
And the other thing that immediately occurs for me over here is, the Western notion of ruin equals apocalypse.
Yes.
Right? Mad Max.
Yes.
That chaos reigns.
Completely. And it's decay, and it's like
decay, everybody's got themselves, and there's anarchy. So either there's utopia or there's anarchy.
It's anarchy, yeah, exactly.
But what you're describing, and what I think is the vital idea, is the idea which you're calling renewal, which I think is a good enough word. But this idea of, you live with decay and rebuilding at the same time.
Yeah. It's just,
and that's how we are. We are renewing ourselves all the time. Ourselves are renewing ourselves all the time.
Ourselves, exactly. We shed
skin. But we are also dying. But we are also dying.
Yes.
But we are also dying.
Also die. Yeah.
But we are also renewing through the children, right?
Exactly.
We are continuing again, but we are also dying, and we are renewing.
Yes.
But we are also propagating life, and we are also preparing for our death, but death is nothing because it's just a start. So
we're continuing, as you said, like we actually didn't die because we're continuing in our children. So,
Yeah, and we should think of architecture and cities and everything in the same way.
I agree.
So Heidegger is completely wrong. I'm sorry, but he's like completely wrong. I'm sorry, it's a bunch of Heidegger people listening to this podcast.
Okay.
This whole idea of the bridge that brings together two sides of a bank and creates poeses. I wonder, well, maybe that idea is compatible with this. I'm not sure. We'll have to think about it.
Yeah.
but there's an idea of perfection, of doing things that are just correct and remain there forever as a kind of a reborn divinity in Heidegger, which may or may not be wrong. I don't know, I have to rethink it. Now I'm suddenly rethinking Heidegger. Maybe we can rethink Heidegger as a kind of an ecology. So that's cool. So you're going to talk about all these things in your studio?
Because that's what we're talking about. Like we had a whole session just a couple of days ago, like the team of which we're preparing, the studio, having these discussions for like 3 hours, basically,
Wow.
and wrapping our mind around, because one part is the studio, but the other side is that there's a whole research team also. And the research and the studio in a way kind of go hand in hand. And so the research concerns itself with, the excavation of a lot of these forgotten knowledges or other forms of knowledge systems, of ways of learning, of precedents, that we can learn from, that have embodied, also architectures that have embodied knowledge and embodied wisdoms that we can then, as you were describing earlier, parse and then analyze and figure out, well, what good, what are the aspects of this particular architecture that we're looking at, and technique, and down to a very technical level, not just in terms of, in general, sort of more as a social or anthropological level, but really even in terms of construction systems, structural systems, and analyzing those and collaborating with structural engineers, that to kind of add to the body of a set of references.
So the students in your studio are going to do this, yes?
No.
The
research team is doing it.
research?
So that's like the research branch of the chair. And then there's like the studio where a lot of the
research branch of the chair. Okay,
yeah. And so in studio, we're putting that approach to practice by really analyzing. The students do something sort of like this. It just cannot be done with enough depth for what we want for the academic publications and things like that. But it would be the same approach of saying that there are things to excavate in the context you're looking at. It might be Zurich, it might be, Geneva or whatever. And some things of value that perhaps have been lost. Mm-hmm. Let's try to figure out what has been lost. Mm-hmm. And does that have relevance today? Mm-hmm. And then we pose a central problem that all these things that you learn through your kind of modest excavation can give you clues as to how you tackle the central problem that we pose for the studio, which is the project that you have to design.
Wonderful. So tell me a little bit more about this chair. You have a research wing, which is to say, what do you have? Historians or PhD students, or
it's up to me. Yeah. So there actually people who are past their PhDs. But the nice thing that's very different about ETH, I think, is that the assistants, both the studio assistants and the research assistants, are all actual architects. Students don't have these jobs. These are practicing architects that are the studio assistants.
I see. How many of these do you have?
Like 3 or 4 because the studios are large.
How many in the studio?
Close to 30 per studio.
30 students. Okay.
Yeah.
And how often does the studio meet?
Twice a week, but continuously. So Tuesday and Wednesday, all day.
All day,
so
9 to
morning
5.
to evening.
Yeah.
Tuesdays and Wednesdays, it's just studio, and the assistants are there, and I go in and out. Maybe twice during the day or something. I check in. But then there's desk crits happening all day.
And the desk crits you are doing, or the assistants are doing, or together?
It's a mix. Mm-hmm. Because I cannot talk to 30 students, even in 2 days. And so everybody, so we make sure that every student talks to at least one assistant, and then most students get to talk to me this week. And then the following, whoever hasn't talked to me gets to talk to me as well.
I see.
Or actually everybody talks to me, but just maybe for short amount of times.
And what level students are these?
These are master and then some upper level undergrad, but these are master studios.
I see. I see. And semester, this is a semester program. And in the end, you have projects and juries like us here.
Because the exercise is one of developing a certain process that takes you away from the regular, we go through this, we do a little bit of research, and then we go and look at all these modernist buildings as precedents for whatever it is that we're making, and then we make a building, end of story. Yeah. So the intervention point for me is actually at that beginning, is the way that the research is done, the things that are considered research.
Yeah.
It's not just the books, it's not just, for example, it's not just, this is something that we discussed when I was doing my thesis with you, just kind of like film and, all kinds of a variety of resources. Yeah. But it's also about trying to excavate the memory of a place in various different ways. So whether it's looking at arts, that has depicted, these areas before in trying to figure out how people see themselves. It's conversations or people who are in the neighborhood, obviously, and there's all kinds of layers of knowledges, oral, anecdotal, family histories, et cetera, in order to start kind of getting a very personal interpretation of a place, a context.
And the place in this case is Zurich?
It depends. The next semester it will be Zurich. It will be Zurich.
So you're excavating Alpine European things or what?
We'll see what comes up. I don't know what I'm excavating until it comes up. That's also part of the that's part of the question. It's like, is there something that will bubble up to the surface that surprises us? Maybe nothing bubbles up to the surface that surprises us.
I guess the question that I'm trying to get to is, because you've used the word place many times, right? Mm-hmm. I'm trying to interrogate the term place. Traditionally, in modern Western thinking, we more or less align place with geography. Geography then integrated into culture, usually integrated into nation.
Yes.
Somehow place becomes community, becomes culture, becomes nation.
But isn't that how cultures come into being? Because it's a set of conditions. The way I see it is that climate and geography that are hospitable, right, attract people to a certain place where they settle. And then one of the things that then further shapes them is the challenges of settling in that place, which triggers a certain type of architecture, trigger a certain type of community life, a certain way of interacting with each other, depending on whether sharing is the best way for you to survive or if be individualistic and basically killing the person next to you in order, because the resources are scarce, is the best way to survive, et cetera, would then shape the kind of people you end up being and the values that you have, which then is culture.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I feel that everything comes from the way that we've had to survive in the natural environment in which we're settled. And so because of that, I feel when we're making architecture, even now when we're incredibly sheltered and we live in these places where we've kept nature out, as you say, perhaps the architecture that composes with that place best is one that looks at the climate, the conditions, the challenges in the same way that we had to before, because I think therein lies clues as to the appropriate way to make architecture for that particular place. Or looking at places like it for inspiration, for more ideas. And that's why I was saying in one of our other discussions that when I'm designing in Niger, I also look at all the other desert places in Southwest America, in China, in India, you know, because the problems and the challenges are the same. So it's not about race, it's not about, you know, economy, you know, or anything right away.
Yeah.
It's actually about how do you survive your natural environment.
Right.
And the genius of that you develop in different parts to solve the same problem is the value to extract. And the wisdom to extract, you know, by going through these excavations. So part of the excavation process that we have to go through, you know, even in the studio, for example, is then when it comes time, once you understand, you know, you've kind of gathered all the information about your context, then you have the central problem that you need to solve, but then you will be encouraged to look at conditions similar to those conditions, but that could be anywhere in the world, which hopefully will also allow you to break out of this, you know, only like Europe and, you know, only this modernist precedents, you know, and all of that. And that it's not about that, because it's not about form, it's not about a certain aesthetic. It's about actually first tackling certain very specific things that have now become incredibly serious, because the planet is essentially rebelling against us. So, and rightfully so.
Right.
And so in a way, it's almost as though we were in a place in our lives now where we again have to learn to survive. Right? Because the planet is falling apart. So now we need to learn to survive. And in Europe, maybe it's not something that's felt as much, but when you're in Niger, you feel that very acutely. From one year to the next, you have catastrophic events, you have droughts, we already have climate refugees, we already have all of these scenarios, catastrophic scenarios that are being talked about to supposedly be on the horizon of, you know, climate change, have been our reality for at least 15 years.
Yeah. I mean, there are two different ideas. I think they're both valuable. So let me try and rehearse them. So the second one, you know, is survivance,
right?
Which is also another. Grace Dillon also talks about this, and she says one of the things to learn from American indigenous cultures is not only what they had in the past, but how they used what they had in their knowledges to survive this absolute devastation they had to go through.
Exactly.
Right? So that's survivance. And I think that's and that also connects to that sort of a similar idea in the South Asian context, which is that when you look at a slum, outside Bombay or Lagos or whatever, what do you see? You can see poverty and misery, or you can see amazing ways to live with very little. Ingenuity, yeah. Ingenuity and wisdom, your word wisdom, right?
And this is why, to your earlier point about how if we're serious about solving these problems, we have to look outside of kind of the normal, you know, sort of centers. It's because outside of the normal centers is already dealing with great challenges that are to come for the centers. It makes them an even more valuable area of study and of learning, or to learn from.
Right.
From the ingenuities that we don't have a choice on our part, but to, you know, produce.
Yeah. And so that's why, you know, the slum porn, have you heard of slum porn studios?
Yes.
So the proper way to do these studios is to learn from the slums and then apply them to Manhattan or Zurich.
Rather than try to go save the slum.
Rather than try and go save the slum. Exactly.
Which is only
the white guilt thing, right?
Superiority complex.
Superiority complex, white
guilt.
It's all this sort of nonsense.
Yeah.
That's great. So, but to return to the other point that you started with, returning back to the question of place, community, right? It's an interesting idea to say that essentially geography, whether it's desert or whether it's climate plus land, let's say geography, yeah? That geography is enough of a basis on which to compare or which to link.
No, I mean, I don't think it's the only marker, but what I'm saying is that similar geographies have a lot to contribute to each other in terms of how the people in those geographies have tackled similar challenges. It's not the same, because otherwise also the people living in those geographies would be exactly the same. And often actually they have incredible similarities.
Right.
So when I went to Rajasthan, I felt that I was in the Southeast Niger desert, which is it's not the Sahara Desert. It's like the desert near Chad, where my mother is from. Because the women even dress similarly.
No, really? They wear saris?
It is shocking. I will send you an image.
Yeah.
They dressed very similarly in terms of colors.
Wow.
Wear the same kinds of veils that I saw the same ones in Rajasthan, and I was completely confused. And they were red with all kinds of, geometric designs on them, and all that. I saw some clothing that had like tiny little mirrors on them. I had an outfit like that my grandmother gave to me when I was 7 years old, when I went to the village, to my mother's village.
But some of that might be also historical, cultural, right? Because Africa and India have been connected for a long time.
Absolutely.
Well, not West Africa, but East Africa for sure.
Absolutely. And also actually even beyond that, there's a lot of trade and contact points that have happened in the Arabian Peninsula. So a lot of the culture in that part of Niger actually came from people who went on pilgrimage in Mecca and have encountered people from the Indian subcontinent, from Persia, and all of that. And then that has impacted the culture. But what was fascinating for me was that, in the same way, my mother's ethnic group, everybody has a nose ring, they have the same kind of veil. They part their hair in a certain way. And it was just, it was such a moment of confusion when I was in Rajasthan. And I just thought, what is happening?
Beautiful.
It was incredible. It was incredible. But again, I don't think that in this particular case, it's not necessarily the climate, but there was an echo there, that I could see, that could be found. And there was an echo, part of the echo is climatic. So when I think of things like the veil is not necessarily a religious, thing. It became a religious symbol, when the religion came, but the veil predates religion because it's a protection layer. And desert people often had veils or turbans.
Yeah, because you want to protect yourself.
It was just to protect yourself. So again, this is why I'm saying that the environment in which we live has a lot to do with the culture that we end up developing, down to even what we wear, right? I mean, not even, definitely down to what we wear.
Fashion is architecture.
Fashion is architecture, is climate, is geography, is all of that. Because it's the imperatives. Architecture first has to shelter us, has to create an environment then when we're comfortable in that shelter.
And that's
which means that it needs to be less hot. If it's cold outside, it needs to keep us warm, et cetera, et cetera. And so that creates a typology of architecture.
Right.
You have courtyard architecture in places where it's really hot because we need to ventilate inside. You have very dense core, architecture in places where it's cold because you need to retain the heat, which creates a certain typology that can be seen in Europe.
So how do we account for air conditioning and heating in this context? Because we made our building 72 degrees or 22 degrees centigrade and used mechanical ventilation with the idea we're going to wear the same clothes all the time and only wear jackets when we step out, so that destroyed that whole thing, right?
We actually, perhaps going forward, as things become more and more dire with the planet, are going to have to learn to live outside of 72-degree temperature
Oh, yeah, for
Meaning
sure.
that in the summer, well, the thing is also you adapt. Like for someone like me who lives right now today in Niger, it was 100 degrees exactly. And we had a power outage in the office for 7 hours.
Excellent.
We have solar energy, but that only runs our lights and our our plugs so that we can continue working. But
Yeah.
air conditioning doesn't function, right? So then we open all the windows. Our office is in a place where there are a lot of trees that actually give a lot of shading.
Yeah.
And it was actually livable. Even though it was 100 degrees outside, inside it was maybe 80.
I grew up in 100 degrees, Mariam. I grew up.
There
We
you
had
go.
no air conditioning growing up.
The inside was maybe 80, 85.
Yeah.
You can actually adapt to 80, 85 without feeling like you're dying, actually. We're just used to 70, which is...
No, we're not used to. We're not used. The point is, we are
Actually,
not
Sunday is
used to
too late
70.
for me.
We are used to temperature ranges. Only
Yes.
recently we have been made to feel. No, I know
Exactly.
what you're saying. When I go back to India now, I can't live without air conditioning. That's because I'm stupid and fat. But what I mean is,
ultimately, because ultimately, maybe one of the things about, and also when you go to certain European countries, there's no air conditioner, right? You go to France, like most places, a lot of places don't have air conditioner, which everybody complains about.
before we go too far down, I want to backtrack again to an amazing idea, which I have never thought about, which is the idea of the Hajj to Mecca as global cosmopolitanism.
Oh, I have so many stories to tell you about this.
Because I always think of the Hajj and Mecca as unifying, but actually it is mixing.
It's also cultural mixing.
It's mixing and
It's
making.
literally, this is why when you come to a place like Niger, a lot of even Africans from south of Niger are really weirded out by Niger and Mali, because we just look like we're not what you expect out of quote unquote Africa. And also we're desert countries, and we have a certain type of culture that is a bit different. So we call it Sahelian culture. There's like this belt right below the Sahara, which is like Niger, Mali, a bit of Senegal, Mauritania, it's like there's a long horizontal belt of countries, and we have a similar culture. And because also we had the same, we were part of the same empires before colonization. And we became Muslim very early for the region. So around like the 12th century. So there's been a long history of that pilgrimage, almost 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Which then means that there's been kind of, so we have ethnic groups also who have migrated from east towards the west, or people who came. So for example, we see similarities in cultures between Senegal and Niger, even though there's a couple of countries between us, because some people have settled. On your way to the pilgrimage of Mecca, sometimes the trip is maybe too long and you end up just stopping there. You don't continue, and you impact the culture, of the place that you settle in, and you make family. I have family in Saudi Arabia who lives in Mecca, who moved there in the 30s. They did not move there. They went for a pilgrimage. So I had my great aunt.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that because we just found them a few years ago.
Yeah. Oh, I see.
Came to Niger and everything. It was incredible. So we found them, and they all look like us. It was incredible. It was insane. Like physically, we still had the same features. My great aunts did the pilgrimage to Mecca, on foot, because that's what you did. So you go on foot, not even on camel. No. This was on foot over months.
Yeah.
And she took some of her children with her because she couldn't leave them to anyone.
Yeah.
And when she did the pilgrimage, she just stayed.
I see.
And it made this whole family. We have all these cousins now who live there, who speak Arabic, but they still speak Hausa. Like they kept the language, the original language that they left with.
Yeah.
But it's this whole strand.
Yeah.
And that's very common.
That's interesting.
And you see something not necessarily in Mecca, you might see something on your way to Mecca.
Yeah.
And then when you return, you might be like, oh, I saw this one building that had this amazing feature. I think I'm going to, maybe I want my house to be more like that.
Yeah.
And also the other impact on architecture of these kinds of travels was that then during the time of the great West African empires, the emperors or the kings who were Muslim and who made the pilgrimage to Mecca would come back with scholars, would come back with builders and architects and, you know, all kinds of other, you know, or would also leave some of their builders and mathematicians, you know, and astronomers there.
Yeah, yeah.
And they would come back with, you know, all these additional things. Again, it was not necessarily coming from Mecca. It would be along the way.
Mm. Interesting.
Or you arrive then and you meet this Persian person, you know, and you would have this conversation because also they had Arabic in common. So they could speak Arabic and they could write it. They could write the script. We should make movies and things about those.
We totally should. We totally should. And all the ocean-going trade, you know, made everything more efficient and moved goods along more distance, you know, straight from, let's say, London to India or whatever. But it lost this whole intermediate system, right? When everything was by land, you had to negotiate every mile, and therefore all these exchanges took place. Everything was a bit more complicated and slower, but it had the advantage of fantastic exchanges.
Yeah, and you can see similar phenomena along the Silk Road, similar, you know, and we had the Salt Road going through the entire Sahara all the way to Nigeria. You can see a similar phenomenon there too, related to that trade. So, yeah.
So good thing we're talking about this, because this is the other kind of important motor of life, right? I mean, one is place and geography.
Yes.
The other is these exchanges.
Encounters.
Yeah.
But then the encounters, I think what's wonderful about them is that they allow you to do that parsing and sifting we were talking about that needs to be done about certain wisdoms, meaning that you see something and it's a picking and choosing of the things that have value to you to incorporate. Whereas what we've been experiencing is this top-down, you know, imposition of this is the only thing that is modern. This is the only thing that is good and has value. Therefore, that's what everybody needs to do.
Yeah, we're not going to do any complaining this episode.
Yeah, let's move on.
So this reminds me, and you know, we should start heading toward the end here. You know, at the next ECC exhibition in Venice with the Biennale next year, we have taken a room in Office of Uncertainty Research has taken a room in the Palazzo Lembo.
That's incredible.
And we are putting in our Kishkinda project. In that.
Oh, that's incredible. I can't wait to see it.
Yes. And we're going to have an event where you have to participate.
I will be there.
You don't know, but you're already conscripted anyway. But what I was telling you was that we're going to have two things. One, we're going to have this Korb chair with a Oculus hanging where you will put it on and you'll watch the video in 3D.
Oh, cool.
But in front of you in this very narrow room will be this huge triptych, which is a redoing of Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, simply in proportions. But what we've done is we have taken Corbusier's Door for the Chandigarh Assembly, which is kind of a reading of geography and place and culture, and superimposed on that, you know, Julie Mehrutu's. Do you know Julie Mehrutu?
No, I do
She's
not.
an amazing artist. She does these migration maps.
Okay.
In my Global Modernism book, those two drawings are placed next to each other.
Well, I have the books. I'll go
Yeah,
take a look.
anyway, she does these amazing migration maps. Beautiful, like how people move. We superimposed the two of those and produced a graphic, and then used that graphic to create this visage of Kishkinda, New York, with our beastie and the city and all the activities. At least digitally, it looks gorgeous. I don't know what it's going to look.
No, it's going to be to kind of have this kind of immersive experience.
Right, but it's the same idea what you were just talking about. It's the superposition of sort of this an idea of geography as a cultural architectural artifact, in this case, authored by the great Corbusier, and this idea of migration maps,
Right.
all put together to create a graphic which is used as the baseline to rethink Manhattan as a forest city using an old Indian epic. So, there are these like 4 or 5 references with the critique of Bosch and, and Earthly Delights. It's all about these things that we've been talking about.
It is.
So my seminar is called Indian Future Modernism. This is what we started with, all we didn't record it. Have you given your studio a title?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Yeah, we're working on that. So we'll see.
Yeah.
Because we're still trying to pick between 3 different projects, and that would determine the title.
Okay. All right. You want to share the 3 different possibilities before we close, or is that still in development?
No, I think it's still too,
Okay.
too unresolved.
Okay. All right, Mariam. That's a great conversation. When I contacted you earlier and I said we need to talk about it, I wanted us to stop complaining and I wanted us to start putting down future ideas.
I felt the same way when I listened to the episode, and I was like, what? No, honestly, yes, it's very satisfying, to say all these things. However, the reality is most of my day is spent trying to find solutions and trying to imagine what the future, should look like. And I was just beside myself that I was like, why did I spend an hour complaining?
No.
That's not what I spend most of my time doing.
That's where we come from, that's where we come from. That's our past. That's the necessary history. And that is what it means.
It also sets the stage. It sets the stage for, it sets up the motivation behind the kind of work that we're trying to do, because we're coming from these places where there's a lot to complain about. It explains a lot of what we do and why we do it the way that we do it.
Yeah.
So,
but the emphasis of our work, the value of what we have to say, the necessity and urgency of accessing global non-Euro-modernist knowledges is not about a cultural piety and historical accuracy. It's about the urgent issues of the future, and the fact that we may be able to get critical inspirations from these things from the past. So it's all about the future. It's about the architecture of the future.
It's all about how we move forward.
Yes.
And that
so we need another word for heritage to close out. I need another word for what, how is heritage a future concept? Future heritage, not heritage futures. What is, how do you make it do the opposite?
So I don't know the word in English, because in French you would say futur hérité, which makes sense. But then you cannot say, what's the action of inheriting something? Oh, inherited.
Inheritance. Yeah. Inheritance.
Yeah, inherited futures.
So future hérité, that's a word, that's a phrase?
Hérité. Futur hérité.
Makes sense?
It's inherited future, like word for word.
Ah, I love it.
Just like you don't pronounce the H, it's like the same word, heritage. Héritage.
So
with the same H, but you just don't pronounce the. But often in French, you don't use the word heritage to mean heritage in the way that you do it for architecture. You use the word patrimoine, which is kind of the body of kind of heritage buildings and all
patrimony.
Patrimoine. Yeah, exactly.
And so patrimony
is more commonly used.
Connects to patriarchy. So let's get rid of that. That's a terrible term.
Exactly.
I like future hérité.
Futur hérité.
Future hérité. Future hérité. Future hérité. All right. I love it. Excellent. We will title this episode Future Hérité. The concept of future hérité. That's what we are talking about.
Yes.
Beautiful,
And
Mariam.
let's
So
hope.
wonderful to talk to you as always.
Likewise. Until next time.
Until next time.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Mary Lee. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.